Welcome to this GCSJ seminar hosted by the Centre for Global Challenges and Social Justice at the Open University. Our topic today is overcoming colonial continuities in the area of social protection.
Great, thank you everyone for coming. For those who might not be familiar, my name is Gunjan Sandhi. I'm the director for GCSJ. And as part of the GCSJ seminar today, we have Rusa Lambin, who will be speaking to us about the social protection and coloniality, learning from the past and present. Rusa is a visiting research fellow in social policy at the Open University and a research associate at Environmental Change Institute at the University of Oxford. Her work is interdisciplinary and spans across global social policy, social protection, global health, and philanthropy. She has additional expertise in women's needs and issues in broader social policy models, transnational climate risks, and sub-Saharan African region. She also has experience working within the UN system. And so today, Rusa is going to be speaking to some of her current work, ongoing work, from what I understand. So on to you, Rusa.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for the introductions. So this is a project that was not by any means an individual effort, but very much a team effort, and the overall work was led by Katie Rowland, whom you know very well, I'm sure. We also had country collaborators from Cote d'Ivoire, Brice Bado, and from Tanzania, Winnie Mwangi. And on top of that, we had Julia and Kevin as well, who you may know. So let's start. Hang on a minute. Let me just work out how do I move forward here. Yes, okay. So just an outline of the presentation. So I'll go fairly quickly through an overview of the work itself, key findings, and then we'll take a closer look at the two country case studies, so Tanzania and Cote d'Ivoire, as I mentioned, and we'll finish with the comparative analysis and ways forward. So to begin with, overview and key findings. So the overarching study objective was to understand what is the role of coloniality in social protection in the global south. We are looking at the colonial imprints, the institutional, legal, and policy arrangements that were put in place in colonial times that we can still see up until today. But we were also interested in exploring post-colonial influences in social protection, some of the continued patterns of power imbalances that shape social protection arrangements in countries in Africa and across the global south. But we have a focus on sub-Saharan Africa in particular, which I forgot to mention when sharing the overall aim. But thirdly, we're also looking at political economy factors at the domestic country level that play into social protection arrangements alongside these historical colonial legacies and contemporary external influences through post-colonial dynamics. And the final question we had was around the ways forward. How can we support countries in shaping social protection arrangements in line with their own national domestic priorities? And yes, here it comes. We had a regional focus on sub-Saharan Africa, keeping in mind that Global South is a hugely broad and diverse area. So we had this focus on sub-Saharan Africa, and in particular Tanzania and Cote d'Ivoire. In terms of methodology, we did literature review, drawing particularly from literatures around coloniality, decoloniality, policy transfer literature, as well as political settlements literature, all of which with focus on social protection in particular in the Global South context. Secondly, we conducted interviews at international levels with different experts working in the area of social protection, including representatives from international and UN organizations, bilateral donor agencies, civil society representatives, but also academic experts and scholars. And thirdly, we had two country case studies, Cote d'Ivoire and mainland Tanzania, excluding the semi-autonomous island of Zanzibar, which have a slightly different social protection setup. We interviewed people from the government, again, international actors and donor agencies in these two countries, civil society representatives, and we also drew on some of the academic interviews with scholars who had particular expertise in these countries or on these countries. However, the topic itself was very polemical, and it attracted a level of, if not resistance, at least discomfort with the term itself. And we actually faced a lot of difficulties collecting data at the country level, particularly in Cote d'Ivoire, where neighboring countries are, including Burkina Faso, Niger, Mali to some extent. These are countries that are explicitly rejecting Western oppression and especially the French presence in the region. And this created also some challenges in conducting the work in Cote d'Ivoire, just given the topic itself. And I wish to mention this just because it kind of sheds light a little bit on the data collection process and the sensitivity of the issues around coloniality. Now, we developed an analytical framework, which we refined throughout the overall research process. And we identified 3 core areas of influence around shaping social protection system, arrangements, interventions in aid-receiving countries. The first is colonial legacy. This includes several components, and we'll look at these in a moment. Post-colonial influence and domestic factors. And these do not act in any means in isolation, but there is an ongoing interaction between these factors. And collectively, they shape the fiscal space that is available for domestic investment in domestic social protection systems. They shape the ideas, they shape the policy instruments that are available, the funding that is available, they shape the legislative configurations around social protection, etc. So these are some of the things that we'll now look a little bit more in detail. I'm going to go through the key findings fairly superficially so that we can spend a little bit more time on looking at the specific insights from the country level. But overall, when we look at the footprint of colonial legacies, there are 4 elements that emerged. Firstly, the colonialism created an economic disadvantage to these former colonies in the way that their economies were structured, with the heavy focus on exports based on key cash crops, but also dependencies and trade dependencies with colonial powers that remain today, particularly for Cote d'Ivoire. They also instituted or introduced institutional and legislative arrangements that we continue to see today. The hegemony of Western ideals and models was also coming through very strongly. And many were saying that there needs to be a greater integration of homegrown ideas and views, perspectives from these countries. And finally, colonial models of social protection are still also relevant today. And here there was just a little quotation from someone who was highlighting that even when we look at international legislation around social protection, for instance, the ILO standards from 1952, these were not developed in the context where countries were independent, but was heavily shaped by Western thinking, ideals, and standards. And there was just thinking around this. To what extent we actually, even in the context of international social security legislation, see footprints of colonialism or colonial era thinking. Now, when we look at post-colonial influences, again, we see a maintaining of unfavorable global economic structures that disadvantage countries that were former colonies. There is a narrowing of social protection agenda compared to the early independence era, in a lot of these countries, and we'll look at that again through the country case studies. But firstly, that we've seen a prioritization of cash transfers, a more narrow approach to social protection and social policy, perhaps more broadly. And secondly, there's been a promotion of consumption-based instruments rather than production-based instruments, say subsidies, for instance. Very sorry, it just skipped. Okay, and thirdly, aid and funding conditionalities is one key tactic that emerges in explaining these post-colonial influences. Export of ideas and knowledge is a key avenue for external actors to pollinate their views, perspectives, and prescriptions for social protection. But at the same time, domestic political economy factors are important in explaining social protection arrangements, mechanisms, instruments in global South countries, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. Resistance and political ideology at the level of local domestic political elites is important, and elites overall and their governance approach is a key explanatory factor as well as civil society and workers' movements, which were both active in advocating for independence in these countries, but also in advocating for better social protection provisions for indigenous populations during the colonial era and after it. And when we look at some of the insights that we captured from the interviews with international actors, Ethiopia was mentioned as a key example of a context where domestic leadership has a clear ideology and where they have been resisting some of the external policy proposals and visions thanks to their ideology. Again, another quote around the elite and to what extent the elite is actually acting in the interest of the country was questioned. And another quote on the role of trade unions in Tanzania, for instance. Right, so let's now look at the country case studies and the insights that we got from the ground. But before we go to those, in terms of the country profiles, it's good to have a bit of background. So mainland Tanzania, also known as Tanganyika at the time, was first colonized by Germany, and after the First World War, colonized by the UK. The early independence government was led by Julius Nyerere, who was a pioneer of African socialism, had a very clear and strong ideological position, collaborated with Cuba, other socialist countries at the time, and propelled also a specific developmental model known as Ujamaa, and focused on collective, equitable social welfare. Tanzania currently has a very big population size, 67 plus million, and high levels of poverty rates. Nearly half of the population is under the international poverty line of $2.15 per day. In comparison, Cote d'Ivoire in West Africa was colonized by France and part of the West African, French West Africa. Sorry, I was thinking about the term in French. French West Africa. And the early independence government was led by Félix Houphouët-Boigny, who maintained a close connection to France, a very different approach to one of adopted in Tanzania. The country has also gone through several periods of civil conflict, driven by ethnic divisions that were partially prompted by the colonial administration itself. Population size, half of that in Tanzania, even less, and also a lower poverty line, poverty level. However, keeping in mind that there's an important regional disparity in Côte d'Ivoire, with the south being much more developed and with the north being much less developed. Quickly on the social protection system in Tanzania. On the top level, you see multiple ministries and government bodies that are involved in dealing with social protection, so a high level of fragmentation. Now I'd like to draw your attention to the two red stars. So firstly, the biggest social protection program or scheme in Tanzania is the Productive Social Safety Net, which has three different components, but it's a conditional cash transfer program funded and originally promoted by the World Bank, but it is operated through TASAF, which is a domestic social protection agency in Tanzania. And at the same time, there is a range of different social and health insurance schemes in Tanzania, and there's a wide range of them. Some of them are designed for particular professional groups, a particular urban versus rural groups. But more recently, there's been the establishment of the National Informal Sector Scheme, which is sort of a universal social insurance scheme for informal sector workers. Of course, a contributory scheme, so limitations in terms of access, but very important to note. In Côte d'Ivoire, similarly, we see a range of different ministries involved. However, in terms of the instruments themselves, the picture is slightly different. So if we look at the orange, so safety net program, it's unconditional, it's much, much smaller than the one in Tanzania, but it is there, and it's increasingly institutionalized in the Côte d'Ivoire context. However, the government is heavily driving other programs, namely the Couverture Maladie Universelle, which is the universal health insurance scheme. This has been an important priority for the government, as well as very recently also a social insurance scheme for informal sector workers, so the Régime Social des Travailleurs Indépendants. And at the bottom, we see a range of different external actors involved in these processes. But let's now go to the findings. In terms of colonial legacies, we see that the institutions and legislation from the colonial era continues to impact in both countries. In Côte d'Ivoire, we see that from the very constitution of the country, which was borrowed from the Fifth Republic in France, there's been a heavy a copy-paste, nearly. This is what our country collaborator would say, a copy-pasting of legislation. Yes, from the constitution to civil, commercial, criminal law, and the French colonial tradition continues to inspire or to be reflected in the social protection legislation in Côte d'Ivoire today. Equally in Tanganyika or Tanzania, when the country gained independence, the country inherited a substantial amount of the legal framework from the British colonial administration, but there was perhaps more alterations and changes than in Côte d'Ivoire under Nyerera's rule in particular, including the incorporation of customary law. Now, when we look at the economic dependency, this remains an important factor, particularly in explaining the restricted domestic fiscal space for actually investing in public policies, including social protection. So there was a colonial structuring of the domestic cash crop economies in both countries. Say in Côte d'Ivoire, the cocoa was of course an important cash crop, and Côte d'Ivoire continues to be the world's biggest cocoa producer. However, it's locked in a low value position as it's producing mainly cocoa beans rather than higher value produce. And in Tanzania, we also see that economic structures were stratified. There was a foreign domination of key export crops, and the mining industry continues to be true today. And there is a lot of current political debate and challenges, for instance, in the area of the mining industry and the country level ownership of that industry. At the same time, we saw large underdeveloped rural areas in the inner land, and this is again true up until today. Now, for the French colonies in the West Africa, it's also very important to mention the CFA franc monetary community, which was established in the colonial era in 1945 and remains in place today. And this enables France's access to cheap raw materials while making export to other countries more expensive. And the French treasury holds a significant proportion of the foreign exchange reserves of the CFA franc community. And this has an important impact on economic independence in the former French colonies. And when we look at the social protection models themselves, the early colonial era social protection instruments that were introduced were mainly focused on limited social insurance instruments aimed at the colonial administration, colonial workers, and a number of indigenous people who were working for the colonies, and a very limited reach to informal sector workers. And again, this is in many ways true up until today. Former public social protection provisions remain very limited to informal workers. And colonial powers disrupted traditional welfare systems. They introduced a centralized governance system. Of course, the very idea of a government, as we see today, was a colonial introduction in itself. There was movement of people from rural to urban areas, etc. And many of these things disrupted traditional ways of supporting social solidarity and support. And we also see the legacy in fragmented and donor-driven social protection policies as well. And if I may draw your attention, for instance, to the quote in the yellow box from Cote d'Ivoire, where one of the respondents says that all the systems are kind of captured, modeled in this French way. It is difficult to dig more deeply about our traditional systems of solidarities which exist in order to perhaps feel something more specific. So it was seen that these models were now restricting the thinking and the brainstorming, if you wish, around how social protection could look like or should look like, so that it is something a bit more reflective of the traditional systems. Moving on to post-colonial influence, the structural adjustment programs were, of course, mentioned as a key turning point. And on balance, the post-colonial influence was considered more important in explaining social protection trajectories than the colonial legacies themselves. So this was highlighted by a lot of the informants as really more important and more interesting, perhaps, as an axis of analysis and focus and explanation. So we saw in the early independence era a heavy investment in social policies and in the 1980s we saw that this was countered and the direction drastically changed via the SAPs, which reduced government spending on social services. And the shift to market liberalization weakened public healthcare and education, which were extraordinary in both of these countries. Cote d'Ivoire a leading example in French and in West Africa, much better healthcare education system in early independence era than in Ghana, for instance. Similarly, Tanzania, very advanced approach under the Nyerere Ujamaa policy. Later, the Millennium and Sustainable Development Goals have shaped policy priorities in poverty reduction initiatives which often prioritize donor strategies over local needs. And we've also seen a dependencies on international donors, particularly the World Bank, and we'll talk about that in a moment. And really a handful of actors were highlighted to now drive their own agendas across social protection domains. And this refers to the different engagement and influence of different actors in different areas. So World Bank very closely associated with cash transfers, ILO very closely associated with anything related to social insurance, UNICEF working on behavioral change programs, children's welfare, the World Food Bank, or PAM here in French, associated with school feeding programs and rural areas more closely. And we also looked at in what ways donors and external actors engage in influencing social protection arrangements. What are the knowledge transfer, policy transfer tactics, if you wish? The ILO draws quite a bit on the soft law around social protection, and countries' commitments to different ILO conventions was strategically utilized in the discussions with governments. The World Bank is a key provider of development finance and thereby has very important influence. And that's something that we could see in both countries. At the same time, social protection policies are shaped by technical assistance, training, study visits. So there's an array of strategies that were identified. And also global agendas, for instance, around the cash transfer models are also influencing trajectories on the ground. And crucially, it was shown in both countries that external actors are actively participating in co-design of national social protection strategies. However, it was questioned whether actually this is leading to a risk of adopting models that are not really fitting or reflecting local realities. And here we see on the left a couple of quotes. For instance, at the bottom, someone says that we often find ourselves implementing donor design frameworks that do not fully reflect the realities on the ground. And one issue that was mentioned, for instance, was that traditionally the focus in Africa is not on individuals or households, but rather the broader family and community, which was seen as one area of difference, for instance. Now, thirdly, there's a continuing of power imbalances, and financing modalities are contributing towards this imbalance. External actors were seen to shape policy implementation more than domestic policymakers. And the financial resources that they provide is a key part of this. And it was mentioned that increasingly we are going towards loans rather than grants, which is creating, of course, dependencies on donors. And this was by some interpreted as a new colonialism, as highlighted on the top box in purple. So this overall dependence on external financing was considered really key in restricting and hindering the domestic ability to drive domestically designed and kind of more homegrown social protection approaches, but also to sustain and expand social protection provision. Now let's move on to the domestic factors. And I've distinguished these now between Tanzania and Cote d'Ivoire because the two countries have very different context and political histories and approaches. So already mentioned, in Tanzania, the Uyama policy emphasized self-reliance, collectivism, universal education, free healthcare were part of the broader social policy model. and social protection strategies. And this was key in explaining the very rapid expansion of welfare investments in the early independence era. Now, later, another example would be the past President John Magufuli's approach and focus on productivist social protection. So, for instance, he diverged the PSSN, which is the flagship social protection program, focus from what he would call the free handouts, so the cash transfers, more to working for money approach, so the public works, for instance. So these dynamics are important in understanding where the emphasis has been in the context of this cash transfer program. However, the domestic factors are not really strong enough in creating a shift in the overall pecking order in the Tanzanian context. Now, looking at Cote d'Ivoire, the first president, Félix Houphouët-Boigny, had a broad welfare/social policy model. So we shifted to an understanding where the government really is responsible to provide for the welfare needs of the population. And study respondents will say that this was a different model to that of France. So including healthcare workforce, for instance, this was sourced as a civil servants, so to speak, which is very different from the French model. And in the current context, the current president, Alassane Ouattara, also has been driving for these key policy priorities, the couverture maladie universelle, so the universal health insurance, as well as the social insurance scheme for independent workers. However, currently the government is not really guided by a strong social protection vision or ideology. And this explains why it has been quite open to talking and discussing and receiving policy advice and reviews from external actors. And this is also shown in the box in the middle. At the same time, the Ivorian leaders and elite have traditionally and continue to do so in maintaining close relations with France, unlike other countries in the region. And again, this is partially explaining the openness to the French impact, but also other external actors. At the same time, it was mentioned that Cote d'Ivoire is, in comparison to other countries in the region, doing fairly well economically. And this allows it to also negotiate and resist some of the policies proposed by external actors. Civil society and trade unions are also key. As mentioned, they were key in advocating for social protection policies and welfare of local populations during the colonial era. They continue to do so today. In Tanzania, for instance, we spoke with NGOs who would say we are still rooted in the socialist ideology. We are fighting against oppressive donor practices. So that was interesting to note. They also continue to fill gaps in social protection provision for informal sector workers and in rural communities. However, especially in the Cote d'Ivoire context, the data shows that a lot of the civil society organizations and trade unions are increasingly co-opted to the global development community and aligned with foreign social protection policies, namely through training, which is provided oftentimes in France, and other influences, including via organization of conferences, etc., which is effectively shaping the ideas and thinking within the civil society. And final point on implementation challenges, especially in the Tanzanian context. It emerged that due to the limited domestic resources and capacity, There is limited resources at the local levels to implement and expand social protection schemes and provisions. There is corruption and there is inefficiencies, which then also hinder the effectiveness of the existing schemes and challenge the expansion. And now, just to wrap up on the country case studies, I wanted to present an illustration of how these different aspects play into a specific social protection instrument or scheme. So here I take the example of the PSSN, the Conditional Cash Transfer Program in Tanzania, and look at the different explanatory axes. So firstly, if we look at the colonial legacy on the top, so we have a restricted domestic funding capacity. There are important coverage gaps within the informal sector, particularly in urban areas. And this now sort of justifies the need for the program and the huge gap to which it is responding to. If we move right to the, actually, let's move left first to the post-colonial influence. So we saw a strong World Bank role in initiating the program and ongoing donor involvement in terms of providing resources, technical assistance, organizing study visits between Tanzanians and other countries where there are similar in the context of developing the program, we have now livelihoods enhancement components, for instance, where the UNICEF is actively participating. So we really see a strong ongoing involvement of external actors. And on the right, we can move on to domestic factors. And here, for instance, the productivist ideology explains that there is the conditionality aspect to the program. So the Tanzanian government leadership was actively promoting for the conditional dimension of the program. And also, as mentioned earlier, the President Magufuli's, former President Magufuli's emphasis on public works component has also explained partially why the public works component is there and why it's been prioritized at some points. May I just check for time before I move on to this part of the presentation, please? How much do I have?
Technically, you are near the end of the time because we have another 20 minutes in the session. So
that's fine.
If you maybe another 5 minutes, that'll give us about 15 minutes of Q&A.
Okay, fantastic.
Brilliant.
Thank you. In that case, I will not go too much in depth with the ways forward. I will just quickly go through the comparative analysis with focus on the historical evolution between French versus British colonies. So the French governed through a centralized direct rule. Colonies became part of the Greater France versus compared to the British, who governed through an indirect rule through the local elites and traditional chiefs. And essentially, in French colonies, we saw that social protection provisions and instruments were introduced earlier. When there was progress in the homeland, there also happened to be some progress in the colonies. At the same time, there was kind of social appraisals, etc., that also prompted the introduction of social protection provisions in the colonies. So in British colonies, this happened much later. Some of the policy debates, for instance, around the Beveridge Report, did not translate into social protection policies in the colonies. And when interventions were introduced, it happened on a very exclusionary basis and privileged the European settlers. And this was partially explained by the indirect rule whereby traditional chiefs and local elites were leading the governance to some extent, and also organizing kind of social protection arrangements in the more traditional ways. There has been conversation around whether there is a contributory model in the Francophone countries and a non-contributory model in the British or non-Francophone countries. To some extent, this is true, but at the same time, there is variation among countries within the specific colonial grouping. So say, for instance, in former British colonies. And this is visible on the map on the right, where I've circled countries in Southern Africa and Eastern Africa. So quickly on what then explains variation across and within colonial groupings. So yes, colonial past and master does matter. At the same time, Thandika Makanda-Wira has theorized that also the colonial era economic model shaped the order in which social protection was provided. So he's saying that actually in labor-reserve economies such as South Africa, where the colony was dependent on labor for mining industries, for instance, we saw an earlier introduction of social protection than in cash crop economies. At the same time, countries had specific contextual factors that shaped colonial policy. Tanzania was much poorer than Kenya. So even though they're neighboring countries, both under British administration, Tanzania saw a later introduction of social protection policies than Kenya because it was deemed too poor to actually sustain these policies. During the post-independence era, in former British colonies that were affected by food emergencies, HIV/AIDS epidemic, these countries saw donor-funded cash transfer programs, so these World Bank-driven programs, whilst other countries, such as those southern countries, Namibia, Botswana, South Africa, these countries introduced social pensions and non-conditional cash transfers way before the World Bank push. And I think that I'll leave it here in the interest of time. Thank you very much, and happy to hear your questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you for watching this GCSJ seminar. Please subscribe to this channel, follow us on social media, or visit our website to learn more about the GCSJ Centre and future events.